I heard this really absurd thing on NPR last night, and this is an exact quote. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think traumatic brain injury is a new injury unique to the war in Iraq. That came from an NPR reporter, and I usually have a lot of respect for NPR, a reporter named Terry Gross. She was interviewing a major who suffered a brain injury in Iraq named Patrick Creed, who was the co-author of a book with Rick Newman about the fire at the Pentagon on 9/11. The interesting part of the interview was not, for me, was not the story about the fire on 9/11, but the way in which the military treated his head injury, the way he understood it, the fact that even someone in a fairly important news job and a fairly objective news source like NPR would have the idea that brain injury really did begin with the Iraq War. Well, what really did upset me about the comment on NPR was first, of course, that the idea that brain injury originated with the Iraq War, which is 5 years ago. So we've only had traumatic brain injuries for 5 years. That, of course, is ridiculous. But it's also disturbing to see that almost an institutionalized concept that brain injury didn't exist before 5 years ago, especially within the military circles, because brain injury is basically part and parcel of warfare. And it goes back to the club. The first time there was someone hit someone over the head with a club, they were trying to give them a brain injury, and that's warfare at its most primitive level. And the first thing they protected in a soldier before all other armor was the helmet. So for the idea to be out there, and I think it is pervasive idea that this traumatic brain injury stuff, this that's coming from these improvised explosive devices in Iraq, is in fact something new, is very, very disturbing. But the other part of it that's very troublesome is that they sent this guy back. They sent this major back into combat, even though he had this one symptom he identified as being related to not being able to recognize faces. Well, if he doesn't recognize his soldiers versus the enemy, that'd be a pretty serious problem. And maybe he can keep uniforms straight. But if he doesn't know his own soldiers, how can he command? But more important than that is the first thing that goes with brain injury is judgment. And if he's got that kind of a brain injury that's causing that significant of a memory problem with faces, he clearly is going to have problems with his judgment. And what does an officer need more than judgment? The other question is, what does this have to do with my practice? Why is a civilian personal injury lawyer worried about brain injury in Iraq? Well, I'm a brain injury advocate, and anything that affects brain injury is part of what I do. I spend probably as much time on my advocacy as I do on representing my clients. But the other part of it is that these labels that come out of military combat, like shell shock, like hysteria, like post-traumatic stress disorder, when they're applied to actual organic brain damage, filter through into civilian diagnosis. One of the most common problems we have in our practice is that our clients are labeled as having a psychiatric disease, typically a psychiatric disease that the defense wants to say was there before our accident, our injury. And these psychiatric diagnoses are just as flawed as the statement that traumatic brain injury is something unique to the Iraq War. When I researched it, when I went back to the World War I literature on shell shock, I found that the entire basis of the diagnosis of psychiatric problem in these soldiers had completely ignored what would have clearly been organic brain damage diagnosis today. And I think if we apply the military misdiagnosis into civilian diagnosis, we're going to have misdiagnosis there. What we need to do now is interact what we're learning about brain injury from Iraq into what we have known probably certainly very clearly over the last 15 or 20 years as the definition of concussion has gotten to be more inclusive. But we also have to apply the military into the civilian and the civilian into the military so that we have a comprehensive diagnosis across the board so that all people with brain injury, whether hurt in combat, whether hurt in civilian accidents, are getting the proper treatment.